Hello, everyone. I am Sophia Ventura-Cruess, a first-year master's student in Peace and Justice at the Kroc School for Peace Studies at the University of San Diego. I'm here interviewing Rachel Locke, the Director of Impact Peace at the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. We will discuss her current efforts to harness evidence-based solutions to achieve peace in our cities. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, Sophia. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I know we're going to be spending most of our time talking about peace in our cities, so maybe I'll just take 30 seconds to mention what Impact Peace is, which is the initiative that I direct under which Peace in Our Cities sits. So Impact Peace was launched about a year and a half ago by the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice and has as its fundamental aim to amplify what we call high potential change processes by bringing evidence, knowledge, and research to bear on those areas where we really feel like there's a lot of energy to do peace building and violence prevention work better. So I'll be talking more about the work of Peace in Our Cities, but I think it's important just to mention the goal of Impact Peace at the start.
Yeah, thank you for that context. I know we're really excited to be able to sit down and talk to you today. So one of the things I'm curious about, as one of the co-facilitating partners of Peace in Our Cities, you work with partners and city governments across a range of contexts from Oakland, California, to Colombo, Sri Lanka, to Nairobi, Kenya. So what is something about urban violence reduction work that spans such different contexts?
Great, yeah. So let me just quickly say what Peace in Our Cities is. It was a campaign that was launched a year ago that has now transitioned into a network or a platform of roughly 17 cities, as you said, spanning the world from multiple different contexts, multiple different countries. We have also 22 organizing partners, from UN agencies to local peace building organizations, all of whom have come together sort of with this bold assertion that the levels of violence in the world today that take place in cities are much too high, and we need to do something about that. And a bold assertion that we have much of the knowledge and the tools in order to do something about it. And there is a real gap in putting the knowledge, the practice, the evidence-informed tools into place to make sure that people can live their lives free from fear. And as the world particularly increasingly urbanizes, with more than 2/3 of the world population projected to live in cities in the next 20 or 30 years, there's an urgent imperative here. So that's how Peace in Our Cities was formed, and that's sort of the goal of the partnerships that have come together. Now, your question was about how violence similarities and differences across contexts. So it is true that violence differs quite a bit, both in type and in scope, right? So the intensity, the levels of violence from place to place. But there are some things that are pretty consistent across contexts. This includes that violence tends to concentrate among certain people. And most particularly, violence tends to reinforce existing inequalities, whether that's inequality within society or inequality within the home, right? So this is where you tend to see more violence against women, violence against children within the home. Violence tends to be about power, right? The demonstration of power and the contestation of power. So there's some consistency there in terms of concentration and about inequalities that we see from place to place. Another thing that's very true about violence is that we have seen significant and meaningful reductions of violence across a range of different contexts. So whether this is Glasgow, which used to be referred to as the homicide capital of Europe, that's achieved significant reductions, or Medellin in Colombia, which many people have studied, or Singapore in Asia, which decades ago had greater levels of serious violence than Jamaica does today, or Oakland, California, which has seen a 50% reduction in lethal violence in the past few years, we know that there are real and meaningful steps that can be taken, and progress is possible.
Yeah, what I find so fascinating about your answer there is it really brings forth a transnational perspective of thinking, how can we find patterns within violence within cities while also saying that there's a particular context for each city. So I find that really fascinating. Another thing we're thinking about is Impact Peace works to bring evidence to bear on what works to prevent and reduce violence in both conflict and non-conflict context. How does this mission come into play in the work done with peace in our cities?
Great question. So again, the world is sort of rapidly urbanizing. So what has been true historically is that there have been people who work on conflict type violence and non-conflict type violence. But as the world increasingly urbanizes, those distinctions and those breakdowns become slightly less meaningful. And so one of the things that we do is bring evidence to bear on what can be achievable, regardless of whether it is termed conflict or non-conflict violence in urban areas that, again, is where the majority of humanity resides and will continue to reside. So for example, we're doing some research right now on mass violence and mass atrocities and cities. The mass atrocity community typically has looked at country levels, and we are now looking at city levels. So this is a way that we're bringing evidence to bear in these various contexts, and is connected to peace in our cities in that we have city leadership, both elected government leadership and leadership in the form of civil society groups, community organizations, standing up and articulating an urgent need to address violence, whatever it's called, whatever form it takes. The other kind of quick things I would say about how the Impact Peace mission comes into play with peace in our cities is that we know that with data and information, we can push back against fatalism. So we know that we can make a case for why it's so imperative to invest in peace. It's because peace is possible. It's because we have seen investments rewards, and that we can no longer be complacent in the type of violence that consists within people's communities. Another area that we find is really important with peace in our cities and the broader Impact Peace mission is that people often know that there are things that can be done, but they don't know how to apply those things in their context, right? So we work not just on the kind of what does the evidence say is the best or the most effective strategy, but how do you, in a highly budget constrained context, invest in putting into place those strategies that have the evidence of effectiveness. And that's really important. So we think about not just the research itself, but the change process and how the research and the change process need to come together for there to be real meaningful and lasting impact.
Yeah, what I think is so interesting about that answer you gave is it kind of blends this, the practical with, the hopeful and the optimistic, and bringing forth the evidence to point that, peace within our cities is possible, while also equipping cities with the resources that they need to really create that change. The last question that I have here is contextualizing within our current climate of COVID-19. So, how has work with peace in our cities shifted during the COVID-19 pandemic? And how are the varying levels of impact in each member city affected violence reduction work going forward?
Great. So I think what we've seen is that while there's been a significant variation in the impacts on violence of COVID-19, there have been two pretty consistent trends across our city and other city contexts. One of which, unfortunately, has been the spike in violence within the home, much of that violence against women, but also spikes in violence against children and elder abuse as well. that has been a pretty consistent finding across countries and cities impacted by COVID-19. The other consistent trend that we've seen across our cities is highly constrained budget contexts, right? So cities already have limited funds to invest in violence prevention and peace building. The pandemic has further constrained those funds and also required huge adaptations in terms of how people work. So those are two consistent findings that I think will have repercussions in terms of city ability to address violence going forward. For peace in our cities, what we have done is pretty quickly adapted to the impacts of COVID-19 by taking the research agenda that we had co-created with our city partners earlier in the beginning of 2020 and update the research priorities based on the pandemic. So we have 6 areas that our cities have prioritized as having sort of knowledge gaps where they could benefit from additional resource expertise. These span from violence against women to violence in slums or informal settlements, how the pandemic has impacted law enforcement's relationship with communities, the way in which organized and armed groups have responded to the pandemic, how violence is perpetuated on social media, and also social media's ability to mitigate some of the harms of the pandemic and calls to violence surrounding that. And then the way in which cities are sort of coping within national policy frameworks and restrictions around the pandemic in ways that reinforce resilience and mitigate violence. So we have a research agenda based on those 6 areas, very connected to sort of urgent adaptations that can be taken by cities and which adaptations and innovations are proving most impactful and positive. Again, highly dynamic and changing context, but we're trying really hard to sort of work directly with our cities in the priorities they have today and making sure that we're all collectively upholding public safety together with public health. And not getting distracted away from the public safety priorities of our cities.
Yeah, what I hear there is that thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, definitely all of the inequalities that we already knew existed prior to the pandemic have just really been highlighted and have, worsened in a lot of ways. But at the same time, we have this really a space for innovation, a space for resiliency that we're all learning how to adapt into. So it's quite a contradictory space. Rachel, that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with me and giving such thought-provoking answers. And I really hope that we have time in the future to continue this conversation.
Me as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity.